Imagine this. The night is heavy with smoke, your house still burning as the echoes of battle fade. You lie pressed against the cold earth, your silken dress torn, your breath trembling as the sounds of foreign tongues echo around you. The invaders are not merciful. They are Vikings, and tonight, nobility means nothing. Welcome to Whispers of History. Tell me, where are you listening from right now? Is it late at night, with shadows flickering on your wall? Or are you letting this story carry you through a quiet morning? Wherever you are, I invite you to settle in, to subscribe if you haven't yet. Because what you're about to hear is one of the darkest truths hidden in Europe's medieval past. This is not the tale of Viking warriors in their glory, but of the noblewomen they left shattered in their wake. Women who wore crowns, jewels, and embroidered gowns, suddenly stripped of power, dignity, and choice. Their stories were not sung in sagas. They were silenced, hidden, or twisted into warnings. But history remembers them, faintly, in chronicles, in church records, and in the whispered fears of generations. Across the 8th to 11th centuries, from England to Ireland, from France to the shores of Byzantium, Viking raids brought terror to noble households. Castles fell, monasteries burned, and behind those flames was a pattern repeated again and again. Noble women taken as spoils, humiliated, traded, or forced into roles they had never imagined. Some were paraded as trophies, their fine hair and jeweled veils torn before crowds, proof of the invaders' triumph. Others were hidden away, forced into concubinage, their lineage mocked as they bore children for men they once called barbarians. For the nobility, it was not just conquest of the body, but conquest of bloodlines, of pride, of identity. One of the earliest accounts comes from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which describes how, in 865, when the great heathen army swept through Northumbria, noblewomen were dragged from monasteries where they had sought refuge. The chroniclers, writing with sorrow, noted that these women, daughters of earls and lords, were defiled before the altar, a phrase that barely conceals the horror behind it. Imagine being raised to believe you were chosen by God, only to be thrown at the feet of pagans in your own sacred house. In France, the annals of Saint Bertin recorded a similar fate. In 845, when Ragnar's fleets sailed up the Seine and besieged Paris, noblewomen were captured and paraded before the city's walls. They were displayed as bargaining chips, their humiliation leveraged to force the Frankish King Charles the Bald into paying ransom. To see a Countess' daughter used as a pawn was not only an attack on the family, but on the very prestige of the kingdom. Even more chilling were the stories of those who disappeared, women swallowed by the longships, carried north to lands where their voices were never heard again. Some chronicles mention noble, Frankish, and Irish women taken as wives or concubines in Scandinavia, their foreign faces haunting sagas that described them only as fair and unwilling. The brutality was not always loud. Sometimes it was silent, calculated. Imagine a noblewoman in Ireland, bound by duty to her family's honor, forced to smile beside the Viking who now claimed her as his wife. Her nights were prisons of touch she could not refuse, her days filled with whispers from those who pitied her, but dared not intervene. For her, survival meant compliance, even as her heart broke in silence. And yet, survival also meant transformation. Some women endured long enough to reshape their fate. The chronicles of Byzantium describe how noble women, once taken by force, later wielded influence in Viking households. They became advisors, mothers of heirs, even mistresses of estates. But this power was always shadowed by its origin, born not of choice, but of conquest. Still, the darkest truth was this: noble women, the symbols of purity and lineage, were often targeted precisely because of their status. To break them was to humiliate their entire family, their entire people. When a Viking dragged a countess from her hall, stripped of her jewels and dignity, it was not only a personal act, it was a political message. Your nobility means nothing before my power. This was the brutality noblewomen endured after Viking invasions, not just the loss of land or wealth, but the intimate violation of body and legacy. Their struggle was not written in the sagas of heroes, but in the silences between words, in the records of ransom, in the fleeting mentions of women lost, in the fear etched into the prayers of survivors. And yet, even in silence, their stories remain. The soil of Europe still holds their memory. But this is only the beginning, because in the next part, we will step inside the halls where noblewomen once ruled and see how, when the Vikings came, those very halls became cages of humiliation. The first shock came not from the sword, but from silence. Imagine the heavy oak doors of your hall splintering under the blows of axes. The great hearth where your family once feasted is now littered with blood and ash. The tapestries that told your lineage, the silver goblets passed down for generations, lie trampled under the boots of strangers. You were the lady of this hall, the wife or daughter of a lord, and in a single night, that title has become meaningless. When the Vikings invaded, noble households were prime targets. The raiders sought wealth, but they also sought humiliation. To seize the treasures of a nobleman was victory. To seize his women was domination. This was conquest at its most intimate, for what greater insult than to strip power from the very women who embodied prestige and continuity? Chroniclers of the time spared few details, though they cloaked them in the language of shame. In the Annals of Ulster, Irish monks wrote of 821, when Viking raiders stormed Bangor and Armagh. They recorded not only the burning of monasteries, but the violation of the women of the nobles. Behind those words lay brutal scenes. Daughters of lords dragged by their hair, wives of chieftains forced to kneel in front of their people, stripped of honor before being carried away. For noblewomen, the humiliation was deliberate. They were not faceless captives. They were symbols. When a countess was seized, it declared to the world that her husband could not protect her. When a princess was carried off, it mocked an entire kingdom. The brutality was as much political as it was personal. Inside the captured halls, scenes of degradation unfolded. Imagine being forced to serve the invaders wine from your own goblets, your hands shaking as they laughed, spilling drink onto the very furs that once adorned your husband's seat. Imagine their eyes lingering, knowing you were no longer untouchable. The hall that once echoed with songs of your family's triumph now resounded with jeers in a foreign tongue. The Frankish chronicler Nithard, writing in the 9th century, described how noblewomen were paraded during Viking raids along the Seine. Their veils were torn away. Their hair, once a marker of their status, was yanked and displayed like spoils. In the Viking mind, this was not only about desire, but about power. To degrade a noblewoman was to conquer her bloodline. And yet, the brutality was not only physical, it was psychological. Many women were forced to watch as their children or servants were slaughtered, their halls reduced to cinders, their own dignity shattered. For noblewomen raised to embody purity and prestige, the act of being touched against their will, of being forced into intimacy they could not refuse, was a living death. Some did not survive it. Chronicles tell of noble women who threw themselves into rivers or from tower walls rather than endure what the invaders demanded. But survival was often not a choice. It was an obligation. Noble women captured alive were valuable. They could be ransomed for silver, traded for alliances, or kept as concubines in the north. Their bodies became bargaining chips. One account from the Annals of St. Bertin tells of Frankish women ransomed back to their families, returned broken, their silence more painful than words. Their presence was a reminder of their family's defeat, their dignity forever scarred. Others never returned. Some became consorts in Viking households, their noble blood now serving foreign lineages. A woman who once dined with kings might now find herself stirring cauldrons in a smoky longhouse, her children speaking a language not her own. She endured, but every moment was marked by the memory of her fall. the brutality could also be ceremonial. During sieges, captured noblewomen were displayed as trophies, forced to stand before their people with chains at their wrists, proof that resistance was futile. This practice was common in raids across Ireland and Francia, where women were paraded in marketplaces, their humiliation a spectacle that magnified the Vikings' triumph. The chronicles hide the sensuality of this cruelty behind the veil of pious language, but we can still glimpse it. The torn veils, the forced servitude, the mocking laughter as noblewomen were reduced from mistresses of halls to slaves of the hearth. Each detail tells us this was not only about power, but about stripping dignity layer by layer. For the women themselves, the struggle was twofold: to survive the physical ordeal and to endure the psychological torment of being seen as broken. Many returned to families who looked at them not as victims, but as shameful reminders of defeat. To be captured was to carry a scar that no ransom could erase. And yet, amid this brutality, there were stories of resilience. Some noble women adapted, using wit and charm to secure better treatment, even influence. In Scandinavia, sagas hint at foreign wives who shaped households, teaching their children Christian prayers or noble customs. Their power was small, but it was survival, a way of reclaiming fragments of themselves in a world determined to strip them away. Still, the overwhelming truth remains. After Viking invasions, noblewomen endured humiliation that cut deeper than swords. Their titles, their beauty, their bloodlines, all of it was turned into weapons against them. They were reminders that in war, the conquest of women was as important as the conquest of land. But this was only the beginning of their ordeal. For when the flames burned out and the halls stood in ruins, their fate did not end. Some were marched onto longships, bound for the unknown north. Others remained, scarred, in lands now ruled by their conquerors. And as the waves carried them away, the sound of their halls burning behind them, one truth lingered: nobility could not protect them, not against the Vikings, not against the soil of history itself. The halls burned behind them, and the journey began. Imagine being dragged to the riverbank, the flames of your home still staining the night sky. Your wrists are bound, your silken gown now stiff with ash, your jeweled belt torn from you and claimed as spoils. Ahead lies the longship, sleek, carved with dragon heads, its oars dipping into the water like teeth biting at the current. For noblewomen taken by the Vikings, this ship was not a vessel of adventure, but a coffin of the living. The chronicles tell us little of what happened on those decks, but the sagas hint in fragments. Women were laid side by side, their veils torn, their hair matted with tears. Some wept silently, others raged, but all felt the same terror. The world they knew had ended. Their titles, countess, duchess, lady, abbess, meant nothing beneath the roar of the Northmen's laughter. The voyage itself was a brutal ordeal. Days stretched into weeks as the longships cut across seas. Salt spray stung the eyes, the smell of sweat and unwashed bodies thickened the air. The women had no privacy. They were captives under the open sky, exposed to the gaze of their conquerors. Hunger gnawed at them, thirst parched their throats, and sickness spread among them. To survive was to endure humiliation as constant as the waves. Some were mocked for their noble birth. A Frankish annal describes how Viking raiders jeered at a count's daughter, forcing her to eat from a wooden trough like livestock, laughing as they spilled ale down her dress. Others were forced into servitude even before reaching the north, commanded to wash garments or clean weapons on deck, their soft hands blistering against rough iron. But the cruelty carried a darker edge. The sagas speak, in veiled language, of unwilling brides carried across the sea. These were women who had no choice but to endure the intimacy of their captors, their cries swallowed by the ocean wind. Chronicles avoid explicit detail, but their silence is heavy. For noble women raised to be symbols of purity, every night on the longship was a reminder that their bodies were no longer their own. And yet, survival demanded submission. A woman who resisted too fiercely risked being tossed into the sea, her death a moment's amusement for the oarsman. Others learned to quiet their defiance, to endure until land appeared on the horizon. Some bartered dignity for scraps of favor, hoping for protection from harsher fates. When at last the ships reached Scandinavian shores, the ordeal was far from over. Imagine stepping onto a beach of grey stones, the air colder, harsher, carrying the cries of gulls overhead. The captives were marched inland, past villages where children stared at them as curiosities. For the noblewomen, every step carried them further from the world of courts and chapels, deeper into one where they were strangers in every way. Some were sold outright, traded like coin. The Vikings trafficked noble captives across Europe, and a woman of high rank fetched the greatest price. In Dublin, a major Viking slave market, noblewomen from Ireland and England were paraded before buyers. Their humiliation was complete. Once honored as the daughters of lords, they now stood as chattel, their lineage mocked, their worth reduced to the silver they could command. Others were claimed as concubines or wives by the very men who had stormed their homes. A noblewoman might find herself seated beside a Viking chieftain at his smoky hearth, her place of honor poisoned by the knowledge of how she came to sit there. She might pour him ale, raise his children, even manage his estate, but her status rested on humiliation, not choice. The brutality of this transformation is captured in fragments of sagas. One tale from Iceland speaks of a woman of noble birth, taken in raid, who bore her captor sons fair and strong. The saga praises the strength of those sons, yet the mother's voice is absent. Was she proud, or did each child remind her of the hall that burned behind her, the family she never saw again? Some women carved survival from this fate. They adapted, learned the language, found ways to influence their new households. A few even rose to prominence, their foreign origin lending them an aura of mystery. But for most, life was a cage, gilded at times, but still a cage. The sensuality of their humiliation lay not in open cruelty, but in the constant reminder of what they had lost. Every time a noble woman poured wine for her new master, she remembered pouring it once for her father, her husband, her lord. Every time she walked through a longhouse, her gown brushing against rough planks, she remembered the polished stone of her ancestral hall. Every touch of the Viking's hand reminded her that she was no longer mistress, but possession. The waves had carried them away, but the soil of their past clung to them like a phantom. They endured because they had no choice, but their endurance was written in silence, in bowed heads, in the eyes that never met their captors. And still, their stories lived on, in sagas that praised the children born of conquest, in annals that mourned the women never seen again, in the whispered warnings passed down to daughters in noble halls that still stood. If the Northmen come, pray they burn your home before they take you alive. But even in Scandinavia, survival brought no peace. For many noblewomen, the longship was not the end of their suffering. It was only the beginning of a new captivity, where humiliation became daily ritual and power always hovered beyond reach. The sea had carried them into exile, but it was the land that imprisoned them. Imagine stepping into a Viking longhouse for the first time. The air is thick with smoke from the central hearth, the ceiling beams blackened by years of fire. Rough laughter echoes from the men gathered around, their voices booming in a tongue you barely understand. You were once the lady of a hall, where silence followed your command. Now you are watched with curiosity, as though you are both guest and prisoner, mistress and slave. The longhouse was no palace. Its walls were timber, its floors strewn with straw and rushes, its light dim save for flickering torches. To a noblewoman used to stone halls, jeweled tapestries, and servants who bowed at her approach, the change was a cruelty in itself. Here, she was expected to share space with animals in winter, to endure the constant press of bodies, to live without privacy. But the humiliation went deeper. Noblewomen captured in raids were not treated as wives of equal standing. They were spoils, and their presence reminded everyone of conquest. At feasts, some were made to serve mead, carrying horns from guest to guest as their captors boasted of their victory. Their fine manners, once symbols of refinement, became entertainment, mocked by men who laughed at the way they walked, spoke, or prayed in foreign words. Yet within this humiliation lay a darker intimacy. Chronicles and sagas speak obliquely of these women as brides unwilling or taken against their wish. Behind those phrases was a brutal truth. Their bodies were no longer their own. At night, in the smoky shadows of the longhouse, they endured what they could not refuse. Every morning, they rose to live another day, their silence the only shield they had left. The transformation of noblewomen into concubines or secondary wives was deliberate. By forcing highborn women into their households, Viking chieftains not only satisfied desire but secured status. To have a countess pouring your ale, to father sons with the daughter of a lord, was to declare victory over kingdoms themselves. Each child born of such unions was living proof of conquest, carrying noble blood tainted by violence. Some noblewomen fought to preserve fragments of their dignity. There are scattered records of Christian women in Scandinavia who clung to their prayers, whispering Latin verses over their children. In the sagas, we glimpse figures who taught their captors new customs, foreign songs, new ways of weaving, stories of lands far away. For them, survival was not only endurance, but transformation, reshaping their humiliation into influence where they could. Still, the daily reality was harsh. Imagine a woman who once dined from silver plates, now stirring stew in a cauldron, her soft hands blistered from rough work. Imagine her brushing the hair of children who spoke the tongue of her captors, children who would never know the halls of their mother's ancestors. Each day carried reminders of her fall, in the rough plank walls, in the smell of smoke, in the laughter of those who never let her forget she was a spoil of war. Some households treated noblewomen with a strange mixture of respect and domination. They were admired for their beauty, their refinement, even their knowledge. But this admiration was poisoned, for it was born of conquest. A woman was praised not as herself, but as proof that her people had been defeated. Her status was both elevated and degraded. She was cherished as a prize, but never free. The humiliation was often public. During feasts, a noblewoman might be compelled to sit beside her captor, her foreign dress replaced with garments of wool and fur, her jewels melted into trinkets for others. Guests would toast to her presence, laughing at how the mighty had fallen. In these moments, she embodied not only her own defeat, but that of her entire lineage. And yet, some women endured long enough to outlive their captors. A few even carved out spaces of power. In Icelandic sagas, there are hints of noble-born women who managed estates after their Viking husbands' deaths, wielding authority over farms and households. But even these figures were remembered not for their origins, but for the bloodline they had given to the north. For most, however, the story was one of silence. Their voices do not appear in sagas or chronicles. We find them only in glimpses, in the note of a monk lamenting women taken from a monastery, in the terse lines of an annal describing captives sold in Dublin, in the hints of foreign wives buried in Scandinavian soil. Their endurance was not heroic in the way sagas praised. It was quiet, brutal, intimate. It was rising each morning after nights of violation. It was carrying water from streams, kneading bread with trembling hands, smiling when commanded to smile. It was survival in its rawest form, stripped of dignity, yet clung to because life itself was the only thing left. The brutality noblewomen endured in Viking households was not only the loss of their status, but the slow death of their identity. They lived as shadows of who they once were, their noble names forgotten, their lineage erased, their pride trampled under foreign feet. And yet their presence lingered in history's margins. Every saga that mentions a fair woman taken unwillingly, Every chronicle that records wives defiled is a fragment of their truth. Together, these fragments form a story of power, humiliation, and survival. A story too brutal to be sung by schools, but too real to be erased. But their ordeal did not end in longhouses. For some, captivity meant years of servitude. For others, it meant being sold again to markets in Ireland, to the east, even as far as Byzantium. Their fates scattered across continents, their suffering woven into the fabric of Viking expansion. And as we follow them beyond the longhouse, into the wider world of trade and slavery, the brutality only deepens. If the longhouse was a prison, the market was a stage. Imagine being led through crowded streets, your wrists bound with rope, your head uncovered so that all might see the pale skin, the delicate features that marked you as noble. In Dublin, the largest Viking slave market of the West, the air reeked of fish, ale, and sweat. Men haggled over cattle and silver, but it was women, especially noblewomen, who drew the longest stares. The Vikings were traders as much as raiders, and the bodies of captured women were among their most prized goods. A noble woman could be ransomed back to her family for fortunes in silver or sold to foreign buyers eager for the prestige of a high-born captive. But the process was always humiliating. Chroniclers describe how women were paraded before crowds, their veils stripped, their fine dresses exchanged for rags. Buyers inspected them as if they were livestock, pulling at hair, gripping arms, even checking teeth. For women raised to command respect, this degradation was worse than chains. The annals of Ulster make brief but chilling mention of these markets in the 9th and 10th centuries. Many hundreds were taken in bondage, the record states, women of noble families among them. Those words, so flat on parchment, conceal scenes of horror. Daughters of lords forced to stand in line as merchants bartered their futures with the clink of coins. Dublin was only one centre. In Hedeby, a thriving Viking port in what is now Germany, markets bustled with captives from England, Ireland, and Francia. Archaeological evidence shows chains, collars, and even pens where slaves were held. Among them were noble women whose very presence mocked the prestige of the courts they came from. Buyers might boast that they owned the daughter of a count or the widow of a chieftain. Her noble blood now a mark of shame, not honor. Some women were ransomed. Their families, desperate to restore their dignity, paid enormous sums to bring them home. But return was not freedom. A ransomed noblewoman bore scars, physical, emotional, and social. In many Christian courts, her captivity made her suspect. Whispers followed her. What had she endured? What had been done to her? Some were pushed into convents, their voices silenced by cloisters. Others lived as shadows in their own halls, never again fully trusted, their humiliation woven into their very presence. Others never returned. Many were carried east along trade routes that stretched deep into Europe and Asia. Viking merchants sold noblewomen to Byzantium, where they entered the sprawling markets of Constantinople. Some became part of the Byzantine court, absorbed into its labyrinth of palaces and harems. To the Byzantines, a woman of noble, Frankish, or Anglo-Saxon birth was an exotic prize. Yet even here, her fate was not freedom. She might be forced into concubinage, her beauty displayed like treasure, but her will ignored. The Arab chronicler Ibn Fadlan, traveling with Norse traders in the 10th century, recorded scenes of slaves being bought and sold along the Volga. His descriptions are clinical, but between the lines lies the same truth. Women taken far from their homes, forced into lives they never chose. Some were paraded naked to prove their health, their humiliation turned into spectacle before strangers. For noble women, raised in courts where modesty and purity were prized, this exposure was devastation beyond words. The brutality was not only in the sale, but in the transformation of identity. A noblewoman who had once been known as Lady of Rouen or daughter of the Earl of Mercia might, in a new land, be known only by her captor's name, or a mocking epithet. Her lineage, her language, her culture, all stripped away until she was no longer herself, but property. And yet, even in markets, there were moments of resistance. Chronicles mention women who cursed their buyers, who fought with teeth and nails, who tried to run even as chains clattered at their ankles. Most were beaten, some killed, but their defiance lingered in memory. It was a final assertion of dignity in a world determined to erase them. The sensual humiliation of these markets was inescapable. To stand under foreign eyes, to be measured and priced, was a violation as deep as any physical act. Each glance was a reminder of loss, of halls burned, of fathers slain, of dignity trampled. Each coin exchanged was a nail sealing the coffin of their former lives. And yet, for all the brutality, these markets were engines of survival. For the Vikings who profited, for the buyers who gained prestige, and, in a twisted sense, even for the women themselves. A sold noblewoman might endure longer than one killed outright. She might find a path to influence in a foreign court, her beauty and wit giving her a fragile kind of power. But this power was born of humiliation, shadowed always by the memory of the market. The story of noble women in Viking slave markets is not only one of loss, but of silence. They do not speak in sagas or annals. Their voices are absent, their lives recorded only as statistics or curiosities. Yet the silence itself is telling. It speaks of trauma too deep for words, of fates too brutal for scribes to describe. Imagine standing in Dublin's market square, the cold wind whipping your hair, the crowd's voices rising as bids are called. You once walked through halls where men bowed to you, where minstrels sang your name. Now, your worth is measured in silver coins. The humiliation is complete, and yet, somehow, you endure. But for many, the market was not the end. Beyond the sale awaited new households, new masters, new humiliations. Their endurance would be tested again and again, until survival itself became their only identity. The market was never the end, it was only a doorway. For noble women taken in Viking raids, sale was followed by absorption into worlds that were strange, glittering, and suffocating. Some found themselves in the smoky longhouses of minor chieftains, others in the fortified halls of Norse jarls, and a rare few were carried even farther into the splendor of foreign courts. Each path was different, but the humiliation that defined them was the same. Their nobility was now a tool of conquest, not a shield. Imagine being taken east along the river routes of the Rus, the landscape changing from cold seas to endless forests. You arrive at Novgorod or at Kiev, where Norse traders rule with iron and wealth flows through bustling markets. Here, foreign noblewomen were both valuable and vulnerable. Some were offered as brides to solidify alliances. Others were kept as household ornaments, their beauty displayed as proof of the Vikings' reach. Further south lay Constantinople, the queen of cities. For centuries, the Byzantines wrote of fair-haired women appearing in their courts, slaves or concubines brought by a noblewoman from Francia or Ireland, sold here, would find herself beneath mosaics of gold, walking marble floors, her new masters draped in silks. Yet the grandeur did not soften her captivity. She was exotic, prized, but always powerless. Byzantine records hint at such women, though rarely by name. They speak of foreign wives who entered noble households. Their lineage whispered as scandal, their presence a reminder that conquest reached even into the heart of Christendom. One chronicle describes a lady of the Franks, taken in war, who bore sons to a Rus prince. Her children would be nobles in Kiev, but her own identity was erased, her humiliation etched into a legacy. Some were absorbed into harems, a word that carried different meanings across cultures. In the Byzantine and later Islamic courts, harems were places of seclusion, where women lived in luxury but under control. For a noblewoman taken there, her silks and jewels might be restored, but her freedom was gone forever. She was surrounded by other women, each one a captive of circumstance, their rivalries sharp, their hopes fragile. To survive was to compete for favor, to be chosen by the master of the household to bear his children. The sensual humiliation of this life was not in brutality alone, but in its theater. Imagine sitting at a banquet in Constantinople, your foreign features admired, your noble past whispered about by guests. They see you as exotic, as proof of the empire's wealth and reach, but not as yourself. Your identity is gone. You are no longer a countess, a lady, a daughter of knights, but a symbol of conquest, dressed in silk. Even within Viking households, the humiliation endured. Some noblewomen became secondary wives to jarls, their children competing with those of Norse women for inheritance. Others were concubines, given chambers but no respect, their beauty a constant reminder of the power that held them captive. At feasts, their presence was a boast. This woman once ruled a hall in Francia, now she serves me. And yet, amid humiliation, fragments of power appeared. Some women learned to wield influence through their children, ensuring their sons inherited lands or titles. Others acted as advisors, their knowledge of foreign courts giving them an edge. The sagas speak of women who softened the hand of their husbands, guiding them with wisdom born of survival. But every act of power was shadowed by its origin. Captivity, submission, loss. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine walking through a courtyard in Kiev, your child holding your hand, and hearing strangers call him half foreign. Imagine watching him grow, knowing he would inherit power from the bloodline of the man who took you, not from the halls of your ancestors. Every smile carried bitterness. Every success was shadowed by defeat. Some noblewomen found a strange form of escape in religion. Records tell of captives who became patrons of churches, dedicating their suffering to God. In Christian lands, they might donate wealth or found convents. In pagan lands, they whispered prayers in secret, carving crosses on wood or weaving symbols into cloth. Their faith became their last possession, a reminder of who they had been. But for many, silence was their legacy. They lived and died in foreign lands, their names forgotten, their stories reduced to footnotes in chronicles. The sagas that praised warriors and kings had no space for their voices, even when mentioned. They were defined by others, the unwilling wife, the fair captive, the woman taken in war. Still, their endurance shaped history. Through them, noble bloodlines were absorbed into Norse dynasties. Their children became rulers, merchants, warriors. Their humiliation became the foundation of new power. And though they were forgotten as individuals, their presence lingered in the very fabric of Europe. The brutality of their fate was not in one moment, but in its permanence. A hall burned could be rebuilt. A lord slain could be avenged. But a noblewoman taken, sold, and absorbed into a foreign household was a wound that never healed. She endured not for days, but for years, even decades. Her life stretched into a long captivity where every moment reminded her of what she had lost. And yet, even in their silence, they haunt us. The chronicles that mention them, the sagas that hint at them, the ruins of halls where they once ruled, all whisper of their suffering. They are the forgotten voices of conquest, women whose nobility could not save them, whose dignity was trampled, whose endurance was their only legacy. But their ordeal was not yet complete. For some, even the courts and harems were not the final stage. They would face death in foreign lands, their bodies buried far from home, their graves unmarked, their names erased. And in those final moments, the soil itself became their last captor. The years passed, but the chains never fell away. For many noblewomen taken in Viking raids, their lives ended not in the lands of their birth, but in foreign soil, far from the halls where they had once been queens, ladies or daughters of lords. Their deaths were quiet, their graves unmarked, their names erased from memory. Imagine lying on a bed of straw in a longhouse. the smoke stinging your eyes as your body withers from sickness. You were once adorned in jewels and silk, courted by knights, blessed by priests. Now, only a handful of children, born of conquest, kneel at your side. No priest will come to give you rights, no chronicler will write your name. The fire crackles, the men laugh in the distance, and you fade into silence. The brutality of noblewomen's fate was not only in capture, humiliation, and forced submission, but in erasure. Their nobility could not protect them, and their endurance was rarely honored. The chronicles mention their suffering only in passing, often cloaked in phrases like the women were defiled, or taken unwilling. These words, cold and clinical, concealed the intimate horrors that defined their lives. Yet even silence speaks. Archaeological digs in Dublin, York, and Birka have unearthed the bones of foreign women. Women buried among Norse. Their ornaments a mixture of Christian crosses and Viking beads. Their remains tell the story that chronicles ignored, that noblewomen were carried far from their homes, lived lives of captivity, and died in lands that were never theirs. Some were ransomed back, but even they carried the scars of captivity. A noblewoman who returned to Francia or Ireland was marked forever. Her family may have welcomed her, but whispers followed her every step. She had lived among pagans, borne their touch, perhaps their children. To some, she was a victim, to others, a stain. Many were pushed into convents, their voices silenced in cloisters, where they prayed away their memories until death. For those who remained in Norse or foreign courts, death was lonelier still. Their children often thrived. Sons who grew into warriors, daughters who married into noble houses. These children carried fragments of their mother's nobility, but rarely their names. The women who bore them became shadows, remembered only as the foreign wife, or the captive taken in war. Their humiliation was buried, but never erased. The sensual cruelty of their fate lingered even in death. Imagine being laid in the earth beneath a mound, the ornaments of your captor's world placed beside you, while the songs sung above your grave were in a tongue not your own. No prayers of your ancestors reached you. Your body rested in foreign soil, your memory already fading. The earth that covered you was not the earth of your homeland. It was the soil of conquest, the last prison of a life stolen. And yet, their stories live on in fragments. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the Annals of Ulster, the Annals of St. Bertin, the sagas of Iceland, the accounts of Ibn Fadlan, each gives us glimpses of what noblewomen endured. They do not tell us everything, but what they reveal is enough to chill us. The burning halls, the longships heavy with captives, the markets of Dublin and Hedeby, the foreign courts where noblewomen became symbols of conquest. What makes their story brutal is not only what they suffered, but what they represented. For noblewomen were more than wives or daughters. They were the keepers of lineage, of purity, of prestige. To humiliate them was to humiliate entire families, entire kingdoms. To strip them of dignity was to strip their people of pride. Their ordeal was not personal alone. It was political, symbolic, devastating. And so, history remembers them not by name, but by absence. Their voices are missing, their faces unseen, their identities erased. But in that silence, we hear the echo of their suffering. Even today, when we walk through ruined abbeys in Ireland, when we stand on the riverbanks of the Seine, when we visit the trading ports of Scandinavia, we tread on the shadows of their lives. The soil remembers what chronicles forgot. The air still carries the whispers of women who once wore crowns and veils, and who died as captives in foreign lands. Their legacy is endurance, but not the triumphant endurance of heroes. It is the quiet endurance of survival, of living day after day in humiliation, of bearing children who would never know their true heritage, of dying far from home. It is endurance as tragedy, not triumph. And yet, by telling their story, we undo some of the silence. We remember that noblewomen suffered not only as spoils of war, but as human beings whose lives were consumed by conquest. We remember that behind every burned hall, every longship, every market stall, there was a woman stripped of dignity, but still breathing, still enduring. The Vikings wrote sagas of warriors and kings, but history whispers of the women who bore the true weight of conquest. So tonight, as you let this story settle in your mind, imagine the halls that burned, the ships that sailed, the markets that echoed with laughter. Imagine the noblewomen who stood in chains, their pride shattered, their future erased. Their voices are gone, but their fate lingers, brutal, intimate, unforgettable. And that is why we tell their story now, because history does not belong only to conquerors. It belongs also to the conquered, the silenced, the forgotten. And through whispers of history, their voices rise again.